issuing bonds for a currency issuing government is a policy choice, not an economic imperative. It's a policy choice. Here's Randy and Yeva. Issuing bonds is a voluntary operation that gives the public the opportunity to substitute non-interest earning government liabilities, think cash, for interest-bearing government liabilities, T-bills, notes, bonds, which are credit balances and securities accounts at the same central bank. If people believe the government needs to borrow to spend, then you get into all of these debates. Who's going to buy them? Is the bid to cover ratio going to be adequate, and all the rest of the kind of stuff. But if you understand that bonds are voluntary operations, then it becomes irrelevant, these sort of debates, whether there are takers for government bonds and whether they're owned by domestic or foreign citizens. So we show most of the debates that take place are just rooted in fundamental myths and misunderstandings about what's really happening, basically the operational side. Now, there may be reasons to be concerned. Warren touched on this the other day. Might it become an issue when you have a large enough stock of public debt and you have a central bank that is following a Taylor rule or something like a Taylor rule, raising interest rates to try to fight inflation, and you could potentially get into a sort of toxic situation where the rate hikes themselves begin to feed inflationary pressures. 20 years ago, I published a paper, it appeared as a chapter in this book, where I sort of, Randy mentioned the other day something about Laffer and the napkin. I didn't put mine on a napkin either, but I drew in it kind of looks like Laffer curve, right? Where the point is that if you're in a low debt environment, and a lot of it, well, there are certain conditions, I'm not going to go into all of them. Let me just leave it at, if you don't have a large stock of public debt and a few other things hold, raising interest rates may have the usual conventional effect. That is, they would be contractionary. But if the public debt gets large enough, raising interest rates from, say, I1 to I2 could actually be stimulative at the macro level. So we got to recognize that. And if that's the case, and it could create a sort of unsustainable situation in terms of the inflation impacts, is there an answer to that? And the answer is sure. You just keep the interest rate down, because the interest rate has become the problem at that point. So Scott Fullwiler wrote about this, and I should say Scott would have been here today, but he couldn't make it, and so this presentation we did together. Okay, so it's the both of us, we both worked on it. This paper was published by Scott in 2005, long before the Fed started paying interest on reserve balances, but Scott asked the question, what would happen if the Fed did what other central banks already do, which is to pay interest on reserve balances? So he wrote this paper, and it's very good, and it's short, especially for Scott Fullwiler. So Scott goes through this, and he says, you know, we could issue bonds, keep issuing bonds, and have a zero interest rate policy, or just manage the interest rate so it stays below the growth rate. What would happen if we did that? Well, we wouldn't have the problem with the intertemporal government budget constraint that all the mainstream economists use to tell us that fiscal policy is on an unsustainable trajectory. So they use this macro model and they plug in the variables, and they say, based on the current outlook for interest rates and growth rates and the debt and so forth, we're on an unsustainable trajectory. We need to make changes. And Scott said, well, if you think it's unsustainable, just lower the interest rate below the growth rate and the debt will converge and the problem goes away. That's basically this problem. So Scott's saying the interest rate is a policy variable. Okay, the mainstream treats the interest rate as what? Market phenomenon, right? The market is doing it, which is why the bond vigilantes matter. But Scott's saying no, set the interest rate. So if it's a policy variable, there's a very easy solution to this problem. All right, option 3. So the first 2 options were issue bonds. Issue bonds and let the central bank fiddle with the interest rate. Issue bonds and anchor the interest rate at 0. Now we're moving into don't issue bonds. Don't issue bonds and let the central bank play with the interest rate. That's another option. Okay, we could do that. And once again, Scott has that base covered. Okay, he's very good at this. So in this piece, paying interest on reserve balances, more significant than you think. Scott says, with interest on reserve balances, eventually the entire national debt could be held exclusively as reserve balances. Just leave it there. It simplifies monetary policy operations, and the more significant point is that it makes it clear to everyone that interest on reserve balances demonstrates that the Fed's operations are offsetting in nature, not financing. So that's the purpose of that paper. All right, option 4. No bonds and ZIRP, zero interest rate or nearly zero kind of overnight interest rate. Bill Mitchell says this is the preferred option from an MMT perspective. No bonds and permanent zero interest rate policy. Now, like I said, okay, that's a policy, it's a prescriptive policy, right? That's his position. He would like to see no bonds issued to the non-government sector and interest rates permanently anchored at zero. He calls it OMF, overt monetary financing. Okay, that's his preferred thing. But he says it's, the preferred option from an MMT perspective. Government should not issue any public debt to the non-government sector, as the benefits of doing so are small relative to the large opportunity costs. All right, so those are 4 options. He goes on, talk about helicopter money. MMT always understood QE as an asset swap with little or no transmission apart from a placebo effect. Okay, doesn't really do anything. Overt monetary financing. He says central bank provides the monetary capacity to support larger fiscal deficits with no further debt being issued to the non-government sector. So what Bill has in mind is the central bank just buys the bonds directly from Treasury. Credits to Treasury's account, Treasury spends, and you're off and running, okay? The original MMT proponents, he says, would characterize overt monetary financing as a highly desirable policy development because it makes a whole bunch of this stuff cleaner and clearer, right? Next part. What should we do, to bond or not to bond? That is the question, right? So what changes? If we consider options 3 and 4, both of which involve not issuing treasuries, at least to the non-government sector, all right? What changes? Well, the big thing is public perception, right? If you're only issuing bonds that are purchased by the central bank, then the public understands that they're not being burdened by this debt stock, that you don't have to worry about who's going to buy them, and foreigners and all the rest of the stuff we often hear about. No increase in public debt for, he says, this is Bill, the rabid financial commentators to beat into a frenzy and push out predictions of insolvency. It would get us all focused on inflation risk instead of solvency, and the morality play, borrowing, driving us all into debt is immoral, and all the rest of it. Who will buy them, paying it back, neuter the IMF, the rating agencies, they have nothing to complain about, and all of that sort of stuff. So he says there are major political advantages to moving to overt monetary financing. All right. I think we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. There's no clear winner here. There's no way to entirely avoid criticism, weaponization, no matter what you do. All right, so I'm going to show you some of this. If we continue to issue government bonds to the non-government sector the way we do today, then we hear the usual stuff. Economists, the press, policymakers, they weaponize the debt. They talk about burdening future generations. Who's going to buy it? They weaponize the sustainability models. They talk about exploding debt service. It doesn't converge. You got people like Olivier Blanchard, Larry Summers, Jason Furman, all using this framework to make the argument that the US needs to reduce the deficit because it's on an unsustainable trajectory based on these models. Weaponize bond vigilantes, you'll lose control of rates and all that sort of stuff. But if we propose ZIRP, which eliminates a lot of those problems, then they weaponize something different. They say, well, if you keep the interest rate at zero, then you're depriving the central bank of its ability to find our star. And so you'll hear stuff about fiscal dominance or one argument or another. It's going to be inflationary and all that. If we say, don't issue bonds to the non-government sector, then they'll just say you're printing money, it's going to be inflationary. So what's an MMTer to do? How are you supposed to do it? They're going to pick on you no matter which one you choose. So we created this little table, and we just sort of imagined, under which of the 4 options do you avoid the most criticism, okay? Where is it the cleanest? And as you can see, there's not really a clear winner here, okay? If we do what we do today, which is column 1, they weaponize the debt, they weaponize the intertemporal government budget constraint. You hear about vigilantes, but, at least you'd leave them with the interest rates so they wouldn't complain about interfering with the central bank. And because you leave them with the bonds and the interest rate, they're not going to complain about printing money. You move to the next option, and you got a different set of things. I don't have time to go through each one of them, okay? But make the slides available. But the point of this is to say there's not a clear winner in terms of the options, okay? So I'm going to put my cards on the table because, as I said, when I first got involved in this project, it was the descriptive stuff that interested me. I liked it. I liked learning about and digging into and arriving at a place where I thought I had pretty good mastery of the monetary operations. It felt good to understand. So I liked the descriptive stuff. And that first paper I referred to earlier was descriptive. And then I went to work on the Hill. And I realized what a mess we're in, because I was surrounded by people working as the chief economist for the Democrats on the Senate Budget Committee, that no one in the Senate and their staffers had the foggiest idea how to understand the role of deficits or debt in the economy, that they were all falling prey to these myths and misunderstandings. So I would go around playing this game, and I would ask them, hey, if you had a magic wand, and I told you you could wave the magic wand and it would eliminate the national debt, would you wave the magic wand? Everybody said yes, not even a hesitation. So of course I would wave the wand. I want the debt gone. I said, okay, well, what if I give you a different wand? And I say, if you wave the wand, you'll eradicate the world of treasuries. No bills, notes, bonds, they're just all gone. Would you wave the wand? And they would look at me like I had 3 horns, coming out of my head, saying, why would I do that? Why would I want to do that? So they didn't even understand that the thing we call the national debt is nothing more than the stockpile, right? The stock of U.S. treasuries held in portfolios and all the rest of it, right? They didn't understand. They want one to go away, but they want to keep the other. Well, I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. So that started to shake my confidence in things. And then I wrote the deficit myth, and I talked about some of this. I told these kind of stories in the book, and I said, look, I'm sort of agnostic on whether we issue bonds or don't issue bonds. The problem seems to be the way we refer to them. It's the word debt that has everybody hung up, right? And so maybe we just need to give it a different name. Warren used to recommend calling it, instead of the national debt, having a giant debt clock loom over people in New York City, ticking away. Warren would say, just call it the interest rate maintenance account. Maybe everybody would just calm down a little bit. We've said, call it the dollar savings clock. We've tried, right, marketing, rebranding. It's just that it didn't catch on, and everyone is still very clearly worried about and weaponizing the national debt. And then you see what happened in the UK with Liz Truss, and everybody believes that the bond market smacked her down and said, you will not get the fiscal package that you are proposing. We aren't willing to finance it. And now labor is terrified, and everybody looks at what happened to Liz Truss, and they view that as a lesson for future governments. And so at some point you go, maybe we're not going to win this fight. Maybe we're not going to get the policy response we need to deal with climate and housing and all the rest of it, because we can't get beyond where we are in our understanding of deficits and especially the debt. So I did an interview with the FT, and they asked me, if you had 5 wishes or a magic wand and you could do 5 things, what would you do? Warren and I talked a little bit about it before I committed to all 5 of those. And I made one of them, I said, no more bonds. Just don't do it. They're more trouble than they're worth. We're not going to educate people fast enough to get beyond this, to get the right policy, so let's just stop, right? So that's kind of where I have arrived. And I like my little play on words here, which is, if we were to do that, if the UK were to do that, it could enjoy guilt-free spending. Isn't that nice? So, you know the German word for debt is guilt, right? And we do feel guilty about increasing the deficit because it adds to the debt, and we have this idea that this is a burden, somebody's ultimately going to have to pay it back. So let's just get over it. Let's stop issuing it. The Labour Party's fiscal rules are clearly, I think, in tension with their missions. You want to build a lot of housing, but you want to rely on the private sector to do it. Just spend and build the public housing. Leave the resulting pounds in the system. Let the Bank of England decide what to pay on those reserve balances and tell the market to pound sand. That is my position as I stand here today. So what can we do to de-weaponize, right? To avoid, this is Scott's line, mass destruction. De-weaponize to avoid. We gotta have policy responses for some of the very critical challenges that we are facing, and we're having trouble getting there, I think largely because we're still too hung up on what the national debt, so-called, means, and the dangers that it poses. So we have written a lot over the years, trying to educate people, trying to help people understand that there are options and that the way we understand things today has flaws and there are misunderstandings and so forth. Again, this is Bill Mitchell. What would happen if a sovereign currency issuing government ran a fiscal deficit and didn't issue debt at all or sold bonds only to the central bank instead of the non-government sector? What would happen if we did overt monetary financing? And he says, with a fiscal deficit and no bond sales, you get excess reserves in the cash system, and the overnight interest rate falls to zero or to the support rate. We've explained this a million times. I have, Warren has, Scott has, ad nauseum. The only difference between this and issuing bonds to drain the reserves is that the central bank has to use a different technique to hit its interest rate target. That's all that changes. And Larry got it. Larry recognized it. There's no difference between issuing the bonds or not issuing the bonds. The difference is on whose ledger are you going to write down the liability, on the central bank's ledger or the Treasury's, and who's going to get, I was going to say credit for, but I don't want to say that. Who is going to pay the interest, the central bank or the Treasury? That's what the difference comes down to. All right? So here's Scott Fullwiler again from his 2005 paper. Deficits that are unaccompanied by bond sales are viewed disapprovingly as monetization, even though there's no meaningful difference between doing it the way we do it today, issuing the bonds. Deficits always create net financial assets in direct proportion, no matter which way you do it. What matters isn't whether you sell bonds, but whether the deficit is too large, given the non-government's desire to net save. Once you have interest-bearing reserves, it becomes obvious that bond sales are offsetting interest rate maintenance, not financing operations, with interest on reserve balances. Eventually, Scott says, the entire national debt could be held exclusively as reserve balances, or, as Lerner said, issue bonds only in keeping with the principles of functional finance. So paying interest on reserves simplifies monetary policy, frees the Treasury and the Fed from selling bonds to support the interest rate target. It just makes it cleaner and more transparent. Otherwise, it changes very little. Fundamentally, again, no difference between issuing government debt to the non-government sector and the central bank paying interest on reserves at the target rate. They're identical, but the politics can be different, all right? It doesn't make it less inflationary if you issue bonds. It doesn't alter the quantity of net financial assets in the non-government sector, and it doesn't add jet fuel to the spending. It doesn't make the deficit more stimulative, because there's no difference between so-called bond-financed and money-financed deficits. There's no reason for the government to sell bonds at all. That's from Fullwiler's paper. No further increase in the debt means no unnecessary and counterproductive debt ceiling drama, no fights about burdening grandchildren, all that sort of stuff. All right, this is just an image that Scott uses a lot because people don't understand. They see the way the government arranges Treasury auctions coupled with deficits. I say, oh, well, this is how we pay for things. And I call this one on the left covert monetary financing. and the one on the right, overt monetary financing. It's the same thing. The central bank backstops the dealers, and it all works the same way. You end up in the same place, whether you do it overtly or covertly. That's the point here. So, would stopping bond issuance undermine central bank independence? No. If you've got interest-bearing reserve balances, the central bank still has control of the overnight interest rates. That's the policy rate. If you moved away from that, and you're not issuing bonds, then government agency securities or swaps could emerge as benchmarks. You could still have something the private sector could use to price risk, even without treasuries. Because you often hear, well, if you get rid of bonds, that's the risk-free rate that's used to price risk for other securities and lending and so forth. You'd have a huge problem if you got rid of bonds. And Scott is saying, no, you wouldn't. There are other ways to do that. The transmission of monetary policy with interest-bearing reserve balances is identical to that with non-interest-bearing reserve balances and bonds to drain the excess balances. Treasury securities could eventually be replaced. The interest rate on the national debt would then be whatever interest rate the central bank is paying on reserve balances. There's no inherent reason for Treasury liabilities to exist across the entire term structure except to support operations for long-term interest rates, if you want to do it that way. All right, now, how would you manage credit conditions without the Taylor rule? If you said to the central bank, keep the interest rate at 0, how do you conduct monetary policy? How do you manage credit conditions? Oh, Warren has a paper where he put forward, 20, 30 different proposals for how to change what the Treasury, the Fed, and the banking system, everything from regulatory changes to operational changes and so forth. So a whole list of things that we've proposed over time about how to go about managing, influencing credit conditions, lending, and all the rest of it. So that's there. Eric Tamoyne and Randy did an edited volume. Randy's book on Minsky, Eric's book on central banking and asset pricing, all the rest of it. It's all there. Well, Bill has dealt with the question of, well, if you're not able to raise interest rates and you have a permanent 0 interest rate policy, won't you just get asset bubbles? People say that all the time. Bill's written about that and addressed those concerns. Everyone from the Federal Reserve to some MMT legal scholars, Nathan Tankis, and others have written to answer this question. How can you manage credit conditions if you're not relying on changes in the short-term interest rate? And the answer is there are 101 things that you can do, all right? If you look at what other countries have done, this is from a paper where they looked at how many times countries have tightened or loosened policy using tools other than the overnight interest rate. Okay, so loan to value, debt to income, other sorts of criteria being used to either loosen credit conditions or tighten credit conditions. How many times have countries done that? This looks at that. This one tells you how effective it's been. And the paper just makes arrives at the conclusion that it's quite effective. You can use other tools that aren't the overnight interest rate to manage credit conditions. Other countries do it, and they do it very effectively. MMT has an answer for every one of these weaponizations. We show that printing money, as Scott says, isn't a thing. If they really understood the operations, they wouldn't say it. If you're not issuing debt, it means you don't have to deal with the fiscal sustainability that comes out of the intertemporal government budget constraint. If you're at ZIRP or managing interest rates, it means you don't have to worry about bond vigilantes. Mosler, Minsky, Mitchell, Ray, Tamoyne, et cetera, have done research on, as I just said, macroprudential, other ways to influence credit beyond using short-term interest rates. Functional finance means fiscal policy has a strong counter-cyclical role to play, and yet we still have to recognize and be prepared for the fact that no matter which option we choose, people are going to complain about one thing or another. All right, coming close to the end. Adding some additional concerns. So we opened a conversation, and as I said, the descriptive stuff we're aligned around. But on the prescriptive side, and on this question about whether We should continue to issue bonds, whether we should only issue them directly to the central bank, whether we should not issue them at all, or whether we should carry on with current practice, issuing bonds to match the deficit to the non-government sector. We've been having these discussions. It's important that we talk about this and that we understand one another's concerns. So Randy's raised some concerns around financial fragility. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not there yet. This is a different one. I'm about to get there. All right. MMTers have had their own additional reasons for favoring no bonds and or ZIRP. All right, this is a different slide. If you are doing things the way we do them today, which is column 1, and you have a central bank following a Taylor rule or otherwise using rate hikes to fight inflation, the rate hikes might become inflationary. So that's an issue. If you do things the way we're doing it today, financial fragility, a la Minsky, right? The rate hikes leading highly levered borrowers into potentially unsustainable speculative or Ponzi positions. It's corporate welfare is what Bill and Warren call it, right? UBI for the rich or whatever, so you have those issues. If you stopped issuing bonds and or did ZIRP, then those problems disappear. You're not going to cause financial fragility if you're anchoring the interest rate at 0. You're not going to have rate hikes becoming inflationary because you don't have the bond market any longer and so forth, right? So those problems go away. Why issue debt at all? If there's no compelling case to do so, as Bill Mitchell says, why do we keep doing it? So I'm going to jump here to some of Randy's concerns that have been raised just in internal conversations, and I think he's had a paper just recently on some of this at the Levy, right? So he's asking, look, if we got rid of bonds completely, would it really not matter? Would it create some problems maybe in terms of the public's portfolio preferences? Would it compromise the business model of banking? Could there potentially be problems there? Does a modern financial sector need risk-free collateral for liquidity? It's important to deal with these questions, right? Shouldn't be proposing something without thinking about all of the potential risks and things that, you gotta anticipate problems that you could create. So we've dealt with these, I think, to some extent. Scott and I were thinking them through on the saving vehicle issue. If you just keep with current practice, then there's no problem. Everybody has their risk-free asset, and you've got your treasuries. Bank costs and profits, not a problem because banks have access to treasuries, a risk-free return. It doesn't compromise the business model of banking. You have no liquidity approach. But if you move to options 3 and 4, and this is Randy's question and maybe concern, then do you start to get into a new set of problems, right? You open yourself up to a new set of problems. And we're open to that possibility. We're saying, yeah, maybe it's worth thinking about, right? All right, so what about 2 additional options? Ask yourself this question. What if the central bank issued the securities instead of the Treasury? There's an idea. Central bank can do that. So central banks have a lot of options if the government stops issuing bonds. You can have central bank securities. You can rely more on reverse repos, time deposit accounts. You can have Fed accounts or central bank accounts, and you could even make them available to the business community or to individuals. It's obvious if we do that, that central banks can never run out of money. Central bank could issue its own liabilities at any maturity it desires. If it did that, it could announce the rates at each maturity. There's a 2-year, a 5-year, a 10-year, 20, or whatever. If you weren't doing 0 interest rate, then you could set rates across the entire term structure and have risk-free interest rates across the term structure for private lenders to price from. If you're doing ZIRP, then you could set rates slightly higher or not. Scott says that's his line. You could have on-tap securities, which would mean risk-free collateral is plentiful. You just announce the price and let the quantity flow. You'd avoid the stupid approach currently employed, which assumes that the desired increase in collateral is whatever number happens to pop out of the budget box at the end of every year. You get the number of treasuries that match the deficit. The mainstream would say this infringes on central bank independence, but the reality is it gives them more tools if you were to do something like this. So in conclusion, Some of you have seen the film, Finding the Money. And those of you who've seen it probably will never forget a particular scene in the film where a White House economist is asked, you know, why does the government issue treasuries? If you have the ability to issue currency, why do you borrow? And he flubs the question, okay? And I think the question is more interesting in an era in which the central bank is paying interest on reserve balances. It's like if bonds are about interest rate maintenance, and that's why we were issuing bonds to drain off reserves to allow the central bank to achieve its interest rate target, assuming the target is above zero. Now that we're paying interest on reserves, now the central bank, what's the further purpose of issuing treasuries? It becomes almost duplicative at that point, right? So I added another column, which is options 5 and 6. We could let the central bank issue securities and then leave the central bank to set the interest rates at different maturities, including the overnight interest rate, or we could anchor the overnight interest rate at zero. Now, does a more clear winner begin to emerge? Doesn't it? Maybe. Warren says no. So this is why we're doing this, right? Because it opens up a conversation. But when we think through the different issues, and we just answered yes or no on each of these, this is how the chart filled itself out, okay? So I'm sure Warren will tell us why this last option is no good, but the point is that no matter what we propose, it's going to be criticized, okay? And our view, Scott's view and my view, is that MMT is about making choices within the right framework and not avoiding choosing something because we're afraid of what the other side will say, accusing us of printing money or compromising Fed independence or whatever. That's not the right way for us to take a decision on this. We ought to do so in an MMT consistent way.